Hey, it's Sarah Burke here from the Women in Media podcast. And before we get started on a new episode, could I get you to hit like, follow, subscribe, hit the bell, whichever app you do your podcast listening in. Make sure you're all set up so you know when there's a new episode and you can help spread the word. Oh, and if you're so inclined, could I ask you to leave a review if the app that you're using does that? You're the best. All right, let's get to the show. I'm Sarah Burke, and this is the Women in Media podcast. My guest today is a Mohawk Anishinaabe who is a brilliant journalist, producer, and host. She's a 60s Scoop survivor, and those wounds have led her to her calling, Indigenous storytelling.
The reason that it was so important to me is that this was one of the first times that the world was hearing about residential schools in Canada and the mistreatment of little children, little Indigenous children who went there and suffered all those abuses, who lost their childhood, who lost their culture, who lost their connection to their families. And as we know, a lot of them lost their lives. And so the first time the world is hearing this, I was the conduit to that.
She also happens to be one of my former colleagues at SiriusXM. My guest today is known as Kim Wheeler, but I like to call her Auntie Kim. How are you?
I'm good, Sarah. How are you?
It's so weird because the last time you and I would have been in this type of environment was like a work Zoom, and I much prefer this. And cheers.
Cheers. Yes, we are sitting here the day before we'll just say it, the colonizers' holiday.
Oh, we're going to have to talk about that.
We're having bevies, so yay us.
Yeah. We'll say happy long weekend. How does that sound?
That sounds really good.
So you are up at a cabin. Is that what you were saying for the long weekend?
I am. I'm in Treaty 2 territory. I'm usually in Treaty 1, but I'm just north of Winnipeg, hanging out here for a week. Unfortunately, the weather is not cooperating. It's really chilly. We actually had to turn the heat on in the cabin. We might have to start a fire tonight. But man, what are you going to do? I'm at a cabin, so who cares?
It's like scorching here.
Oh yeah,
totally. No, right? It doesn't matter. But yeah, we're having like a heat wave in Toronto.
Oh, nice.
So I do want to talk to you about your career. You've done a million things in the media. You still at this moment do a million things in the media. What would you say is the favorite out of all the jobs right now? Because you have a few.
Oh, yeah. I think my favorite is doing the Auntie Up podcast, where it's a podcast by, for, and about Indigenous women talking about important shit. And we center Indigenous women's excellence and all the amazing things that Indigenous women are doing across the country. So it's so great to, sit and be a part of these incredible conversations that are taking place where we just, celebrate one another and talk about and give space to conversations that don't normally happen, that never happen in the mainstream media. So a conversation at length, right, about what we as Indigenous women, non-binary, two-spirit folks are interested in. And it doesn't feel like work.
So you have a co-host for that, right?
We do. I do have a co-host. Her name is Jolene Banning. She is my co-producer as well. And then we have a rotating list of guest hosts as well, because we also wanted to make space for other Indigenous women to carry on these conversations. Because as Jolene likes to say, let's face it, we're not experts in everything. And as I like to say, although we really like to believe we are.
It also seems like kind of like a nice opportunity to almost set some women up who maybe don't have a ton of broadcasting experience who might want to get into that.
Yeah, for sure. We do work with at least two hosts who don't have broadcast experience. And I was actually just thinking about this the other day because, I always kind of go backwards in my thinking, like instead of, okay, let's set it up to do this and this and this. It's like I let things happen organically and then I go and analyze it and break it down and think, okay, how can we do this better? And I think one of the things I'd like to do is bring all the hosts together and, and just give some host 101 training to and just, even like sometimes even an old pro like Rosanna Deerchild, we just need a little bit, we just need a little bit of reminding how to, do the job. And she's used to hosting a show on her own, right? So now she's, working with co-hosts and, how do you, keep control of the interview while, your best friend is sitting there co-hosting alongside you, right?
Yeah. There's some like listening and reacting. Those are all things that are new to co-hosting, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And especially the reacting, because if you're not used to being in front of a mic, sometimes people get really nervous and they want to rush through things. They are like, oh my God, okay, I have to get to the next question. But, we bill it as a conversation. So we just have to remember, how would we react if we were sitting around the table drinking tea or drinking wine, as it were? And, let's try and get that vibe into the show.
You're someone, and I was shocked at this, but you're someone who I think was a little timid around the microphone when I first got in contact with you about that SiriusXM gig. Would you say that that's become a comfortable thing now?
Yeah, I think I've gotten a lot more comfortable in front of the mic. Because my entire career, I was behind the mic. I was the producer. I was telling the host what to say. I was writing for somebody else. I was writing in other people's voices, and I wasn't writing in my own voice. So, when I did get that SiriusXM gig, thanks to you, Sarah, I thought, I didn't want to I didn't make a show for like the first 2 months. I was like, oh, we'll just put it off. And that's what we kept doing. And then when I finally did do my first interview, I did it with Tanya Talaga, who I'd been working with on the podcast Auntie Up. We actually hadn't even started that podcast yet. We were in the process of beginning it. And so I was comfortable interviewing her because we had already worked together. Again, her as the host, me as the producer. And so now it was kind of switching around, and sitting in my home studio that I created during the pandemic specifically to do the SiriusXM gig it probably took me like 10 takes to get through my intro. And I felt ridiculous being in this room, trying to project in my head, giving myself advice to every host I'd ever worked with, and thinking, okay, I feel so bad now. I feel so bad that I'm, thinking, how hard can it be? Just like read the words I wrote for you.
Yeah.
And then having to read them and sound normal. And, it's not, it's a definite skill for sure to sit in a room by yourself in front of a mic and be engaging. You know what I mean?
100%. But you know what? There's something there, right? Like suddenly you're speaking in your own voice, producing in your own voice, and hosting in your own voice. I even find this funny with the email you just sent me. I said, hey, can you flip me your bio? I didn't have it saved in my personal email. I only had it in my SiriusXM email. The email title that rolls in, braggy long bio. It's so funny to me that I don't know, it's like you're not sure of yourself, but you should be.
Yeah, no, I really think you're right about that I still feel like I'm trying to find myself, but I also know who I am. And I think that comes from being adopted out as a baby. Most people who know me know that I'm a 60s Scoop survivor, raised in a white family with very racist, very abusive parents. And so, claiming that space is also part of my healing journey, and being able to say, yes, this is who I am. And yes, I've done all these things, right? And I can do that among my friends, my close friends and my family. But, to put it out there to other people, I just think, oh man, this bio is ridiculous. Because you're right. Like, I've done a million things. And I think, like, why can't I just focus on one thing? Is it my ADHD? It's probably my ADHD, but people seem happy with my work. So I guess I'm doing okay.
So let's go back to the beginning of your career. And yes, we will get to the colonial holiday and all these things. But I know that you've worked at CBC on a number of different productions. But like, what made you want to get into media?
I was always very curious. I was a very curious child. I always asked questions of people. I remember getting scolded by my mother for asking an aunt that I had just met, how old she is, right? How old she is, what does she do, blah, blah, blah. And I was probably like 5 years old asking adults questions about their lives that people just in polite company did not ask those questions. And then I realized that I really loved writing and creating stories and creating worlds. And so it was just natural that I would, go into journalism.
I was going to say you could have written a novel too. Do you have a novel in the works?
God, no, I'm too lazy for a novel. I'm the kind of person that, unless I'm getting paid,
fair.
Yeah. Maybe if I get a grant, but then I'd have to write, a grant proposal and.
Yeah. So what was the first job you went for in the media?
The first job I went for, so I was still in journalism school, and we had to do internships. So I had a 2-year college diploma from Grant MacEwan, which is now MacEwan University in Edmonton. And I actually was already working at the Edmonton Journal because that past summer, the summer between my first and my second year, they were looking for a sports stats editor, which was probably one of the most ridiculous jobs I'd ever gone for because 1, I was not a big sports fan back then. And 2, I could not do math. So there were no programs back then that you could just plunk in the numbers and bam, 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 they would reconfigure all the stats and where, which hockey team was in which place. That all had to be done manually, and all those numbers had to be input manually. And I fucked it up every single time. And the sports stats page was the
I
most.
would have too, man.
Right? The sports stats page was the most read page of the paper. It was the page of the paper that the managing editor looked at first thing every single morning. So every time I got into work, they're like, you screwed up the hockey stats again. And it's like, what am I going to do? Right? So then when it came time
how will I ever have a career?
Right. So when it came time to actually doing an internship, we were told we had to do them at weeklies because I don't know why, like the program head didn't think anybody was ready to work at a daily newspaper. I was like, excuse me? Like, I already have a job at a daily newspaper. And they're like, well, they're not going to give you an internship. And I was like, oh, yes, they fucking will.
This is what I love about Kim Wheeler.
Like right from the start. So I get to my sports job, to my desk. And, I can look across the newsroom and the managing editor's office is right there. So I thought, you know what? Screw it. And I walked right into his office and said who I was, what I was doing, and that I wanted to do my 3-week internship placement there. And he was like, okay, sure. And just like that, I was doing my 3-week placement. And then I got this summer reporter gig, the Cub reporter gig for the summer as well. And my marks in that 3-week placement my marks went from being a C student to being an A student because the reporters worked with me and helped edit my stuff and, told me what was the most important and how, I was like, okay, so if the on the ground people are editing and doing this really well, how come we're not getting the same education in college?
Yeah, I found that same thing. I did most of my learning like during college and university, like in the radio station. Like, yes, you get like the fundamentals, fine. You get that in school, but situational stuff, like what do you do if that all comes from being on the ground?
Yeah, for sure. And then, from there, I went to like having babies and in and out of media jobs and working at a weekly and freelancing and working for the Canadian Press for 5 years and leaving that because I had a shitty boss, there who I just was like, I can't keep working here under these circumstances. Even though my female colleagues were so incredible and they were so generous and I learned so much from them. But when there's somebody else who doesn't show you the respect you deserve, I can't work for people like that.
Yeah, I get that. What makes a good manager? You've been through so many.
What makes a good manager? I guess respect is a two-way street, right? And managers have to realize, I guess people who are promoting people to managers, the best reporter doesn't always make the best manager. Just like the best server at a restaurant will not always make the best manager, right? If you have to talk to your people and find and really look at those skills and what their skills are and do they have leadership potential and if they do have that, are they going to be able to keep their ego in check? Because I've had managers who have said, you are disobeying me and you're being insubordinate and I don't like to be called out in front of other people in the newsroom. It's like, but you don't know how to do my job. And I know you don't know how to do my job because you don't know how to mix audio. Right? And so, trust your people, trust the people who you're managing to know that they know what they are doing, especially if they have, 20 plus years experience.
I want to ask you about the good too, which is next. But what was the most painful, I guess, position that you've been in the media, and why?
The most painful position would have been when I had to quit my job as a producer on the radio show Unreserved on CBC. It was a show I was brought on. This is a long story. So I was an associate producer doing producer work, and anybody who works at the CBC always knows that they never, you're always working above your scale, right? Above your union position. And that has been a problem for decades. So that's not a secret. But it finally came time that the CBC was going to invest more resources into Unreserved, and they were going to hire a senior producer. So I had been making the show with Rosanna Dearchild, the host, for 5 months, the two of us, because I don't know, they just kind of start taking people away from us because we were, no, I shouldn't say we. I'll speak for myself. I was labeled difficult and challenging, and I guess like they, in no way was I ever going to be senior producer material. The woman who had decided that had never had a conversation with me, did not look at my resume, did not know my work experience, my history, that I'd already been in the media for 23 plus years, that I was I am an award-winning producer. All she saw was the time I'd spent on the show being handled by other people and what other managers were saying about me without ever having a conversation. So I realized that I had hit the proverbial buckskin ceiling, and that was it. So I was, again,
I have felt that way before. I understand this.
Yeah. So I wasn't going to stick around. Like, if I don't get the respect that I know I deserve, I can't stay in that place, because I know I have so much more to offer. And sometimes I think people will go, okay, so I walked away from a full-time permanent union job with the CBC, which is like quitting a 10-year position at a university, right? I could have stayed there. I could have kept my mouth shut. I could have just went in every day and did my job and walked out. But as you know, Sarah, that's not me. Like, I can't keep my mouth shut. And life is short. Like, you have to be somewhere that makes you happy. And doing the job you love in the way that you know how to do it.
I'm sorry, are we in therapy right now? Because this is just like, it feels like you're pulling words out of my brain.
Right?
Like, it's funny though. This. I think early on when you and I started working together, we sort of like, we kind of said to each other, we have so much in common, even though we come from very different worlds.
Yeah, we bonded really quickly, I think. And that doesn't always happen.
I think it's because we don't shut up.
That's exactly it. We have shit to say, yo. Cheers to that.
Cheers to that. So, but coming back to, you know, all these positions that you've held, what's been your proudest moment in your media career so far?
Oh, I would have to say winning a New York Festivals award.
Okay, tell me about the award and what it was about.
Yeah, so I was working on a show called Revision Quest. And it basically was a comedy show that myth busted Indigenous stereotypes. And through the use of like songs and sketches and, you know, funny stories and interviews, we myth busted a whole bunch of stereotypes. When the TRC commission was happening across Canada, and Winnipeg was the first one, I went down for the day and I recorded a sharing circle, and it was really powerful. And I came back and I said, I want to make an episode about residential schools. And the team didn't think that this was on brand for the show. And I said, well, sometimes we can go off brand and we can do other things. And this is a really important topic. We need to be telling this story. And it was, you know, I was in a room full of men, and, you know, maybe half of them were non-Indigenous. The other half were, but they were all like, nope, this is not a Revision Quest show. We can't do this, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, okay, well, here's the thing. I'm going to do this show on spec, and then you guys will listen to it. And the next day, they all came back and apologized and said, you know, I really started thinking about what you were saying. And I think we should step off what we usually do and make this work. And I was like, okay, well, I was going to do it with her without your blessing, but whatever. So I went ahead and I made it. And 10 months, you know, it aired. And 10 months later, I get a call on a Saturday afternoon from my senior producer, Doug Holmes, who actually I absolutely love. He is one of the best bosses I've ever had. I just want to give a shout out to him.
I feel like someone else who's been on my podcast has mentioned him. Where does he work?
He works at CBC.
Got it. Continue.
Yeah. So it's a Saturday afternoon and my phone rings and it comes up Doug. And I'm like, uh-oh. Why is he calling me on a Saturday? What did I do? The show aired earlier because now we're in another season, and I feel like I'm in trouble. I always think I'm in trouble when somebody is calling me off hours, which goes back to the abusive parents and being filled with guilt. But so I answer it, and he goes, "Are you sitting down?" And I was like, "Oh, sure, I'm sitting down." And he goes, "You won a silver medal at New York festivals for your episode of Revision Quest."
Amazing.
Yeah, an episode that they didn't even want to do, but they did it because I forced them and said, "This is what I'm going to do." So I got to, I paid my own way out to New York for the awards ceremony, and broadcasters from around the world come to this. It's, it's not like a huge gala or anything. It's a fairly small, intimate affair. There's a dinner. You give the award. They give the awards out to the people who have shown up, and then there's photo sessions and stuff afterwards. But the reason that it was so important to me is that this was one of the first times that the world was hearing about residential schools in Canada and the mistreatment of little children, little Indigenous children who went there and suffered all those abuses. Who lost their childhood, who lost their culture, who lost their connection to their families. And as we know, a lot of them lost their lives. And so the first time the world is hearing this, I was the conduit to that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I hear a lot of storytellers go and musicians go, "Oh, well, the music just came through me. Like I'm just the conduit." And I never really understood that because I'd never had that feeling before. But for this episode and these stories, I just knew exactly what to do and how to edit it together. And the segments were broken up with Stephen Harper's apology to residential school survivors in the House of Commons. And one of the executive producers said, "How did you come up with this idea?" I was like, I don't know. It just happened. Creator willed it.
Huh. So what year would that have been when you made that production?
2011, I think. So 11 years ago.
How does it make you feel, like, to know that even when you and I first started working together, which is a decade later, that there were still people who didn't accept or acknowledge that residential school thing?
Well, I'm not surprised. And I think this is why I do the work I do. And, and do I get tired of telling, sharing these stories with non-Indigenous people and explaining things to them, off air in meetings? Yeah, absolutely, 100%. But if they're still listening, and I feel, and you can tell when people are listening or when they're not listening, right? Then it's still worth it to me to carry this work on and go, like, you have to know this, and you have to know why this is important. And a lot of times, people of a certain age will go, they'll be very apologetic that they never learned this in school. And I usually tell them, like, that's okay. You weren't taught this in school, but you're being taught it now. So what are you going to do with this knowledge going forward?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you and I, when we started our working relationship too, I was definitely a little bit anxious about, like, how to navigate a lot of stuff. Like, you came onto the team at the perfect time when, we were talking about rebranding what used to be called Canadian Indigenous Peoples Radio to something more meaningful. And you showing up was like right? I had so many Indigenous women telling me how amazing you were. And they were like, you and Kim are going to be friends. Like, you guys need to talk. I'm giving you her email. I'm giving you her text. I'm giving you all, like, it was almost like the universe pushed us together. So then we get into this space where I'm doing a lot of asking your opinion on things and perspective. And I know that that comes up, like you just said, in everything you do, whether you're working with the Indigenous Screen Office or SiriusXM. So like, how are you navigating those conversations now? Because I really like thinking about Canada Day coming around again. It just seems like a mark on the calendar for review and reflection. Last Canada Day, I remember all those conversations we were having about like, what is appropriate this week and what is not. And a year later, like, where are we at?
Well, I think, last year, the country was grieving. We were grieving collectively, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And everyone understood, yes, we're not going to have a celebration this year. Or the celebrations are going to, we're going to scale them back. And now this year, people are like, okay, well, that was last year and now it's past, so let's just keep going. But it's not in the past. That children's unmarked graves are still being, I hate to use the word found because our people always knew they were there. And the country
mainstream
should still
found,
be,
I guess.
Yeah, I guess so. Mainstream has discovered that, children died at residential schools. Even though we all knew this all along, and everyone should have known this because it was in reports like decades ago, but for whatever reason, I guess the country just wasn't ready to reconcile that. And this year, I've seen a lot of angry rhetoric, especially here in Winnipeg, because one of our gathering places, called the Forks, usually has a Canada Day celebration and they do fireworks. And they announced this year that they were rebranding. Speaking of rebranding, they were rebranding it to call it a New Day celebration. And they were not going to have fireworks. And there were some pretty outraged people, including a woman who is running for the mayor of our city. And I hope nobody votes for her after that, because that will just be pushing reconciliation back, 50 years. It seems so crazy.
Right.
And it's like, it's fireworks. Nobody is saying you can't celebrate your country. Nobody is saying you can't wave your little Canadian flag or put Canadian flag tattoos on your cheeks or whatever you want to do. It's just a different name.
Mm-hmm. And the symbolism of that different name shows an appreciation and respect, right?
Yeah, and then you look at, what's going to happen in Ottawa, or what did happen, right? It's going to be an interesting time for sure to see how this day is gonna play out. But the one thing that I really do love about Winnipeg, so the Assiniboia Downs, where the horse racing is, they're actually going to have a celebration. They're actually calling it a Canada Day celebration. They're charging people $10 a head to get in. That land is owned by a First Nation.
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense.
So I say reconcile, right? Reconcile that. You want to have your Canada Day celebrations? You go and you pay the Indians to celebrate it, man.
It's like a lot of what we're seeing, whether we're talking about like Fashion Week. I know it was just, I think it was just a couple of weeks ago. It was Indigenous Fashion Week in Toronto.
Mm-hmm.
And even when it's like New York Fashion Week, right? We're starting to see Indigenous designers, Indigenous artists, Indigenous landowners be like part of the early conversations about planning large events now. That's one thing that I think is, definitely more prominent since our discussion a year ago. Like I've started to see a lot more people putting their money where their mouth is in that sense. It's kind of like the same thing we talk about Pride, right? You can put a rainbow logo on whatever you want, but unless you're actually like partnering with an organization that actually does something for the LGBTQ two-spirited community, then
yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. And it's great to see. Do I think there should be more? Absolutely. Yeah. But we have to, take things incrementally, and I'm good with that.
Mm-hmm. So On a media scale, reflecting on the year that has been, just again, I don't know why, but this like July 1st, I'm really looking at it as like, what have we accomplished and where have we slid sort of in the last year? Like in Auntie Up, in your work with SiriusXM, and the Kim Wheeler Show, which, by the way, Kim Wheeler was embarrassed to call the Kim Wheeler Show. I will just put that on the record. What are the conversations that you're pushing forward now?
Oh, well, so I really believe, so for the Kim Wheeler Show, I really believe in the celebration of arts and entertainment because I don't think our artists are celebrated enough, that the mainstream focuses on a few people. And there's so much talent out there that I really like to have all of those different artists come on the show, whether they're in theater or they're film or they're making a web series or they have their own podcast or they're an artist, right? Or, an actor who is, has like a dozen credits, but has never been featured in an interview. I really love giving space to people like that.
Underdogs.
Yeah. So some of the guests that I have had on is Amy Jackson. She's an Indigenous businesswoman for Native Love Notes. It was a shop that she created during the pandemic. Eugene Brave Rock, who is in Dark Winds on AMC and another show called That Dirty Black Bag. And he has a great, interesting story about how he got the role in Wonder Woman. And Sherry McKay, who's TikTok famous, has over 500,000 followers, has like 17 million likes. And I have my wish list of guests, including Sarah Podemsky, who's part of the Podemsky sisters, because I've had Tamara on. Oh, actually, I haven't had Jen on. So so Tamara and Jen.
Add her to the list.
Right. And then I also want to get Alma Tail Feathers on the show as well, because I think she's a brilliant filmmaker. She's also an actor. She's probably a producer as well. And just to give her that time to have a really in-depth conversation instead of like the 7-minute edited down, watered down version, right? Just really to like really get into a meaty conversation. With Auntie Up this year, we're in our second season. We've recorded 4 episodes. 2 are out. Our next one, they get released every Tuesday. And our next one, I think, is either on sexual health or maybe matriarchs. But the theme that it has evolved from them is that we are looking at intergenerational strength. Because we hear a lot about intergenerational trauma and how we can pass that trauma on to our children and our grandchildren, but we also can pass our strength on. And that's where our focus is this year.
Oh, what a nice way to reframe that.
Right? And that's the thing. That's the thing about being an Indigenous storyteller, is that you get to control your own narrative. And I'm all about controlling my narrative now and controlling how we talk about Indigenous people. So now we're changing the narrative to talk about our strengths instead of our traumas. And not that our traumas aren't important to still talk about, but there's enough of that out there. And we need more of the positive.
You mentioned on Auntie Up that one of the upcoming subjects was going to be sexual health. I'm curious, in your circles, how has the overturning of Roe v. Wade come up? Because Indigenous women are part of those marginalized communities that have less access than the average person would to those things to begin with.
Yeah, I think it's a little too brand new to really have delved into those conversations. But I know that my daughters are incredibly pissed off about it. I see them post and share memes on their socials all the time. And I still can't believe that happened. Like, it's so weird. I saw this post the other day that said rapists have now just been able to choose who their mothers are going to be. The mothers of their children are going to be. It's chilling. And thank fuck we live in this country, even though, Canada is not without its issues, but at least we have the right to an abortion.
Mm-hmm. And you know what? Hearing your daughters be pissed off about it makes me feel really hopeful for, the up and coming generations too, at least, because there's people who are going to fight for those things if it ever goes there.
Yeah, my daughters they're really well informed, and what I love most about them, well, I love many things, and this probably isn't what I love most about them, but one of the things I love about them is that they take those conversations to their friends and inform their friends and talk to their friends about it as well.
Absolutely. Tell me why you named the podcast Auntie Up.
Oh, because it works on two levels, like when you want people to buy into things like betting, like, okay, Auntie Up, right? ANTE, but Auntie, AUNTIE, right? So in the Indigenous community, we all have aunties, and in the non-Indigenous community, right? And the aunties are the people who you can go to when you can't have that conversation with your mother, right? When you can't have that conversation with your best friend or your friends or your sister. It's somebody who you really trust to tell you the truth, to sit you down and go, okay, this is the way it is. And you have that circle of trust with them. So that's why we called it Auntie Up, because we're going to tell it like it is.
I love that. Yeah. And you're also kind of asking people to like ante up, like
right?
Get with our shit.
Exactly. So yeah, again, it works on two levels. Yeah, I love it too. I only wish I'd come up with that title.
Oh, who came up with it?
Jolene Banning actually came up with it because we were discussing what the podcast was going to be, and she went off on a rant, and she's like, people should just ante up, blah 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 blah, and we're all like, oh my God, that's the name. And again, the title centers Indigenous women.
Yeah. I wish I could have recorded the conversation where Siobhan and I were trying to convince you to name your show The Kim Wheeler Show, because that was hilarious. Like, you were like, no. Like,
I still shy away from telling people the name of the show. I always go and they go, oh, and what's your show called? And I'm like, oh, it's a ridiculously named show. It's The Kim Wheeler Show. And people are so supportive.
Just like your long braggy bio.
Right? People are supportive. They love it. And I'm just like, oh God. But I'll rarely say like, you're listening to The Kim Wheeler Show. When I'm voicing my show, I'm just like, hey, thanks for joining me, blah, blah, blah.
There's something there. I got to say, there's something there with what you were even saying about like getting the guest hosts like all together at one time or whatever. In bringing those strengths through generations, like you were just talking about, like there is no reason that Kim Wheeler can't do that. Like you are the person to do that. So please give yourself some cred, woman.
Oh, Miigwech, I appreciate you saying that. I'm trying to really listen to the bestie, Rosanna, and really claim that space and not be bashful. You guys are right. I deserve that space. I'm taking that space. I'm using that space to make space for others.
Yeah, and that's the best thing that you can do with it. Absolutely. So I have two final questions, okay? I probably should have prompted you on this last one, but I always ask the women that I have on to nominate other women they admire to come on the podcast. It should be pretty easy for you to come up with a few names, but I will give you a second to contemplate if you need it. I feel comfortable enough to ask you because of, how closely we have worked. But like, what is something that needs to leave Canadian vocabulary that like just pisses you off when you hear it?
I mean, when people go lowest on the totem pole, or let's have a powwow about that, or circling the wagons, or jumping on the bandwagon. The other one that really irks me is when they say it falls on deaf ears. And I say that because my youngest daughter is deaf. And, she may not hear it, but she understands language, right? She has her own language. She has ASL. She has signed English. She reads and speaks written English. So when you say falls on deaf ears, it makes deaf people sound stupid. Like they're not listening, but they are listening. So I really, that one just grinds my gears so much. And the other one's like lowest on the totem pole. Yeah. Like lowest on the totem pole. So people think, oh, like you're at the totem pole, everybody is equal on the totem pole, right? And these are not my, totem pole is not part of my culture, but this is what I've been told. And that if they're all equal on the totem pole and each figure has a story, and if you think about it, if you want to use that analogy, lowest on the totem pole, the one at the bottom is the one holding everybody else up. So it's actually the strongest figure.
Wow. Look, I'm so glad that you just told me that. I have never thought of it that way.
Yeah. Or lowest rung on the ladder. I mean, you could say lowest rung on the ladder.
And then we don't care.
Right? Yeah. Then you're okay.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. So to end the podcast, let's hear about some of the women that you would nominate to come on and share their stories of both, like, there's pain and strength and celebration kind of in every episode.
Well, I think everybody would really benefit from, again, just shamelessly, my bestie, Rosanna Deerchild, she has incredible stories. She is a matriarch in her own right. She is living, even though if you asked her if she was a traditional person, she would tell you no. But she really is, because not only does she look after her elderly mother in her home, she has also taken custody of her niece as well, who she raised from a small child, two of them as small children, and they call her mom, and she is their mom. And that, that really is traditional. And then the fact that she helped start APTN News back when APTN was just starting out. She's had several of her own shows. She's a national radio host. She is a published poet. She's a public speaker, and an all-around hilarious person who just turned 50 years old, even though in October she thought she was only turning 49 and had a minor fit. She realized she was hitting the big 50.
And you're like, sorry, can't avoid this one. This is the 50.
Yep. Yeah. So we had a surprise party for her last week. It was great.
Oh, that's fun.
The other person I'd nominate would be Connie Walker, who is an incredibly brilliant investigative journalist. She was with the CBC for, I think, like 20 years or so, and left. She left as well, and now works with Gimlet Media to produce her own podcasts. Her latest one is called Stolen. I think it's Stolen: The Story of St. Michael's, and it chronicles her father's residential school experience. So, telling a story like that is so incredibly personal. It takes a lot of strength and a lot of soul searching, and
you would know, right?
From doing my own, but hers is like an 8 to 10 parts. I don't know if I had that in me to do 8 to 10 parts, but yeah, Connie is a really amazing, lovely person too, and just so intelligent. Actually, I just want to talk about Blood Money, about my 60s Scoop doc. So I did it for CBC for the doc project because I have a love-hate relationship with them, and it's like self-flagellation every time I want to like work with them.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Right? So the doc project is actually ended this season. They did their last brand new episode at the end of June, and now they're going into repeats over the summer of all their most favorite docs, one of which is mine, which will air the last week in August. So I was really honored when I got that email, and they said we want to replay your doc. And I was like, okay, wow, Amazing. Love it. Love it.
That's a nice full circle moment, after everything that you've been through, for sure. It was so nice hanging out, having a little long weekend beverage with you. But of course, I told you when I launched this podcast that you needed to come on, and I'm happy we found some time for that. Your story is amazing. Keep doing amazing things, and thank you for coming on.
Chimigwech, Sarah, thank you so much for having me, and you keep doing amazing things. And the next time I'm in Toronto, which may be for the Lady Gaga concert, we'll get together.
Kim has really done it all. And from her show on SiriusXM to her CBC doc Blood Money, I encourage you to visit the links in the episode notes and follow her on social media. Aside from sharing important stories and, well, saying it like it is, which, as you know, I appreciate, Kim is hilarious. As always, thanks for listening.
A woman of ill repute is a person who's found success in non-traditional ways, often risking the disapproval of society. They're usually fearless, and more often than not, they're quite funny. They're certainly interesting, and sometimes inspirational. I'm Maureen Holloway, and along with my friend, noted broadcaster Wendy Besley, we talk to these women on our podcast, and we call it Women of Ill Repute. You might like it. Lots of people do. And all you have to do is listen on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or you could go to our website at womenofillrepute.com. That's kind of our online home. And while you're there, it wouldn't hurt you to sign up for our newsletter. I'm just saying.
Another Sound Off Media Company podcast.